Good evening. My name is Damian Chandler, and I'm going to be presenting on the professionalism and the future of the marriage, family, and therapy career and profession. This is for our law and ethics class at Alliant University. There were three major ideas that they wanted us to explore. And the ideas were to demonstrate the importance of awareness and sensitivity in applying the AAMFT Code of Ethics in a multicultural context. Number two, to describe the importance of law and ethics to the practice of MFT in the recovery-oriented public health, mental health service systems, and integrative care systems. And number three, just to discuss the future of marriage and family therapy as a profession. I had the honor and the opportunity to interview four professionals. Natalie Alexander is a licensed counselor. Edsel Cadet is a PsyD candidate. David Defoe, clinical director of Amara Counseling Services, and Allison Williams, a judge on the Sacramento Superior Court. So let's start with the area of challenges. Natalie talked about a concept to which she didn't give a title, but it sounded like dual relationships. She said that there are times that she's meeting with couples where she recognizes that the presenting issue has more to do with one spouse than the other. And she wants to find a way to address that in a compassionate way. And so she chooses to see them individually before she sees them together as a couple. The challenge is that there are some insurance companies that see that as a dual relationship, and they don't believe it's ethically right. So they will insist on this couple to have individual counseling with another counselor. What she shared, though, is that even though she recognizes some of her biases, that she really thinks that that is the best therapeutic framework and approach for couples like this. David Defoe, when he was talking about challenges, talked about an entirely different ethical area. He sees a lot of teenagers in his practice, and he is always challenged by parents wanting information on their children's therapy. He calls it over-involvement. And he says that there's a fine line between the age of consent and just not being an adult. So the child is not yet at the age, is past the age of consent where they could ask for therapy, but they're not quite an adult. So managing any disclosure that he gives to parents without harming the relationship that he has with his client is extremely, extremely difficult. The second thing that he spoke about was telehealth. He spoke about the idea that doing telehealth while patients are in shared spaces is really difficult because it's hard to ensure that as a therapist, you won't do them harm. He says that many of his patients decide, or he encourages them to do telehealth visits in the car so that they can be alone. Edsel shared the idea of diagnosis integrity, and his was really interesting. He actually shared a scenario where someone came into the office wanting for him to confirm or sign a letter that they had a particular diagnosis. And the challenge was that he had not found that diagnosis to be true. They were trying to get this diagnosis because they were trying to get gender confirmation surgery. And so they needed him to affirm gender dysmorphia. He ended up going to one of his supervisors and passing the case on to them. But he talked about the challenge of there being some benefit to a client based on a particular diagnosis and feeling that pressure to give that diagnosis to them. Judge Allison Williams spoke about child rights. And this was really interesting. She talked about counselors and psychologists being in the court when she's a presiding judge, and she says that it's always challenging based on who the counselor or psychologist has the relationship with. If the counselor or psychologist has the relationship with the child, um, and there's a custody issue, there she knows as a judge that there's information that that counselor has that can really turn this court case on its head. However, there is also the respect for the counselor, the confidentiality that a counselor has to maintain with their client, even though that client is a child. Role of ethics. Again, Natalie brought up something that was in the area of dual relationships. She says that she feels really challenged with dual relationships to the point that she does not share with her friends that she is a counselor. As a counselor, she always feels the desire to help, but realizes that it really affects her friendships and that there's a power dynamic always in play whenever she is counseling a friend. And then she finds that it also changes the relationship where they feel like if her friends feel like if they have to watch what they're saying and those types of things. So she's had to find non-counselor words to have conversations about challenges that her friends are having. Defoe talked about legal versus ethical, and his take on this was absolutely phenomenal. He's actually a professor. He talked about the fact that what is legal is not always ethical. And the fact that the counselor needs to know the law and needs to understand how it relates to the code of ethics. For the example he gave is that, for example, in red states right now, there's some places where it's illegal not to report that a child has sexuality issues or is thinking about transitioning. The danger for the client, but there's danger for the client in spite of the law. So as a counselor, do you choose to stand with your client and hold confidence, or to follow the law in some red states, and share with the parent what the child is sharing with you? So he gave a great piece of advice. He says, make sure as soon as you open up your practice, as soon as you start practicing, you find a good lawyer and a liability attorney. And then he said, number two, document everything that's being said. This was really powerful. He said, document what's being said in your process notes and not in your progress notes. He said that your process notes are really yours. They don't belong to anyone else. You don't have to share them. You can destroy them if you wanted to. But your progress notes belong to the client. And if if that client is a minor, it actually belongs to the parents. So process notes don't have to be shared, but progress notes do. Edsel talked about the fact that law and ethics kind of helps him to stay safe as a clinician. And it also empowers his client by telling them what their rights are. It teaches them to know their voice and their power to make sure that the counseling environment is safe. Cultural sensitivity. Going back to Natalie, she gave this example. The example was that she had a Nigerian family coming in for therapy. She knew that they were Nigerian from her intake. So what she did was do some background study on Nigerian culture and knew that this was a family. And in Nigerian culture, the male is really the head of the house. It's a very patriarchal society. So she had to find a way to be able to deal with the male and help the male to be able to see that his actions were harmful and hurtful to his wife. And so she started the whole session by deferring to him. As a woman, she realized that she would need to give him respect because that was something that was really big in their culture. And she was very deferent to him, asking him questions and asking for his advice and his thoughts. That process really opened him up. And when he was finally open, she was able to share with him some of the challenges that the wife was having. She said by the end of the session, he had his hands around the counselor's neck, telling her, "Thank you so much for helping me to see what I could not see." Defoe talked about curiosity, the idea that as a counselor, we need to be curious. We need to put ourselves in the positions of being the students of our clients. We need to ask questions. So by allowing yourself to be their student, they're going to teach you about the nuances of themselves within their culture. Uh, Edsel talked about social factors and racial diagnosis stigma. This was really, really interesting. He talked about the influence of cultural awareness, and sensitivity that allows him to see blind spots in presenting problems beyond the DSM-5. We've talked in class about the idea that the DSM has some racial biases that are really built into the fabric of that tool. And he says that cultural sensitivity allows him to be able to see that certain diagnoses are really create a stigma in certain racial groups. And sometimes the symptoms that seem to be emerging are symptoms that are being fueled by societal or cultural or social justice issues at home. And in order to solve the symptoms, in order to take care of the symptoms, there's need to take care of the issue, the social justice issue, the financial issue, the bias issue, so that the symptoms can go away. The second thing is he talked about there being biases where if a Black person presents with these symptoms, oftentimes he's seeing it diagnosed as schizophrenia. When a white person is identified with the same symptoms, he's seeing it diagnosed as something softer, something more palatable, something less violent. And so he says that there is cultural sensitivity helps you as a therapist to be able to diagnose well. Licensing and regulations. Natalie shared that she is actually a counselor in 2 states. And she shared the idea that she has a license in both states. So I thought that she is unable to counsel some person not being in the state. But what she shared is that if you have a license in both states, then she shared, first of all, that it was very easy to be able to get the licenses. All she had to do was fill out the form and pay a fee. And in some states, there's not even a need for an additional test. But she shared how she does counseling with patients that don't live in her state, but she has a license for that state. She says that if a client is traveling and does not establish residence in a particular state, she is able to do counseling with that client. But as soon as the client established residence in another state, then that client is now considered a resident of that state and comes under that state's licensing and regulations. So that was the one caveat that she shared. Dr. Defoe talked about the idea that licensing and regulations do 2 things. One, it ensures relevance, but then number 2, within his practice, he has a number of associates within the practice, people who don't yet have their license. And it's really a licensing and regulation that encourages supervision. And he thinks supervision is really important. Edsel took it a completely different twist. He talked about exploitation. So right now, Edsel is in a supervision relationship, supervisory relationship at a particular practice. And he says that he sees licensing and regulation when it comes to supervision as a tool of exploitation. Um, he he exposed the idea that students are often doing free work for supervisors and making no money until they receive their licenses. And it has been his experience that many supervisors give the hardest cases, the cases that they don't want to deal with, to their students. Challenges. Natalie talked about countertransference and the lack of black male counselors. Um, she talked about the fact that as counselors, we can't get too caught up in what is happening in our lives so that we blur the lines of therapy and our real lives, what we're experiencing in our lives. But then, number two, she talked about the need for more Black male counselors because she talked about the therapeutic alliance that can happen when someone is sitting in front of them and they're the same gender or the same race. And she talked about the fact that Black male counselors are really, really hard to find. When it came to challenges, Dr. Defoe talked about the effectiveness of telehealth. What he shared was that there's a dynamic in therapy that occurs when a counselor and clients are in the same room. He talked about there being an unease for them in sharing their story with someone physically there, but that unease is an intervention that often yields great fruit. He really mourns the idea that counseling is losing the human touch. For Edsel, his thing was simple. He says that he's seeing more and more couples coming in for therapy, but fewer and fewer marriage and family therapists. Judge Williams brought up something that she saw in the court, and she wanted counselors to know about it, so I decided to share it with you. And it's called marital privilege. And just recently, she was dealing with a couple. There was domestic violence, and what the couple did was the male decided to get married to the lady. They decided to do that because of marital privilege, the thought that the courts cannot force a couple to testify against each other. Now, in that case, it did not work because the violence occurred before the marriage. But she said that she's seeing that a lot, this idea of marital privilege. She's seeing it a lot in the courts, and it's something that counselors should pay attention to. All right. Now we're going to talk about the future of marriage and family therapy as a profession. Natalie said that the future for MFTs is bright. She just wanted to encourage marriage and family therapy students to dive into trauma-informed therapy. Defoe talked about the fact that the idea of family is rapidly changing. What a family is, the definition of it is rapidly changing. And because it's changing, the counselor has to be able to adjust to those changes so that we can respond to families, no matter their culture, no matter their background, and no matter the nature of their family, we can respond to them well. Edsel spoke, when he was talking about the future, he was talking about the need for an assessment for the efficacy of online therapy. What he's finding is that there are a lot of people who are applying for online therapy, but the situation that they're going through or what their presenting problem is would be better dealt with in the office. In fact, he has questions with certain diagnoses whether or not virtual or telehealth should be an option at all. So he was suggesting that there's need for an assessment to find out what presenting problems are best dealt or can be dealt virtually, and which ones are best dealt in the office.